Right, I'd just like to welcome you along for the first of the seminars for today. I'm Annette Marshall. I work for SAC Consulting, now in the Perth office. I was a photographer, hence why I'm the one that's here. Please feel free, if you've got any questions at all, just let me know. And if there's any terminology that you don't understand, feel free to pick me up. I know that when I did it last time, there was stuff I went through and people were kind of totally lost. So please stop me, ask questions as we're going through, and if there's anything at all, just let me know. So this is what we're going to cover today. Briefly talk on kind of breeds, and then we're going to go through how to grow grass species and why they're important, some different grazing systems if we've got time left, and finally, and probably the most importantly, is a bit about the soil status even. So yeah, we've got the different breeds here. Different breeds suit different grassland types. So you wouldn't put a big Charolais cow up on the hill, whereas you might put Highland cattle up there. You wouldn't put different types of sheep breeds, so your Blueface Leicesters wouldn't last up there, whereas a Blackie would. So your breed probably depends on your hill type, or your land type, what kind of grass you've got, or what kind of altitude you're at, that kind of thing. The other thing that I think is important and possibly gets forgotten about is personal preference. So if you don't like a black-faced yow, why would you ever have them? You know, you get the same technical stuff says that's only where the blackies would go. If you hate them, you're not going to enjoy it, and that's probably even more important as a smallholder than it is like the farmers I speak to. You know, it's got to be something that you want to do. So this is one of the bigger sections. How do you grow grass? So I'm going to take you through a year in the cycle of grass. We'll talk about how to grow it and what happens at different times of the year, and the agronomy of the crop. So it's kind of how to get the most out of your grazing management. So this is the basic blade of grass, if you like. That's so you've got your roots, which take up all the nutrients. Your growing point, which the tillers kind of grow the leaves out of. So the more tillers you can get out of a plant, the better. And then the leaves is what kind of grows and gets eaten by the animals in particular. Yeah, of course you can.
What's a tiller?
A tiller, so the tillers are the bits that grow out the stem. So you've got the roots and then the tillers come out. So the more tillers you can get growing out the bottom of the grass, the more leaves you can then get from them. So I probably mentioned later, but if you graze younger grass after it's sown with sheep, it kind of encourages to till it out, not cattle because they just basically kill off the grass, but if you put sheep on it, then they kind of just encourage it to, instead of growing up, it kind of spreads out and gives you a better base and gives you more leaves. So what they talk about, especially in kind of the ideal grazing, is to graze your grass at the 3-leaf stage. So each tiller grows 1 leaf, 2 leaves, 3 leaves, and then the 4th leaf dies off. So the best, the most efficient is to graze it when it gets to the 3-leaf stage. So that's kind of stage highlighted in the picture. One of the ways to encourage this is rotational grazing, and I'll go on about rotational grazing a bit later. What you don't want to do is to shade out all the grass, and then all the leaves die, and it just ends up with dead matter. So you just want to ideally get it about then, probably about 7 or 8 centimetres. Would be the grass height when it gets to the 3 leaves. But yeah, that's the ideal. The reason you want to graze it about the 3 leaves is partly to keep the grass growing and the grass alive, but also to get the most out of your grass. So you don't need to worry about the figures, but the whole point is ME is metabolised into energy, which is the more energy there is in the grass, which the animal can consume, which will help it grow. So when you get it to be sort of 3-leaf is the optimal, once it becomes sort of older than that and the leaves start to die off, the energy reduces, so your grass is less productive, so you'll not be able to graze as many animals, or they'll not grow as well on the lower areas. I've got a bit about the 3 leaves, but I already mentioned that. So tillers only ever live for a year, and then you want daughter tillers. So you want to produce enough sunlight and enough nutrients for that tiller to keep producing, and it'll produce another tiller, which will be called the daughter tiller, which will be the next year's growth. So you'll keep going through. So we'll start with a bit about winter grazing, if I can find my notes. Winter, probably the most important thing is to look after your animal throughout the winter. Grass won't grow in the winter particularly, so you might need to do a bit of combination feeding, whether you've got some grass left over, you might need to feed silage or grass or have some kind of forage crop. What you really want to do in your winter is look after your soils. So any grass in the winter is probably grown in the spring or the summer and it's just not been grazed down at that time for various reasons. So you really want to protect your soil. You don't want any overgrazing where it just causes any poaching, any soil compaction, anything like that, because the grass it'll be killed off, the soil will not be suitable and it will not grow away in the spring. So what you really want to do is, if possible, move your stock about quite a lot if you don't have land. I know that in smallholder situation that's not always the easiest, but yeah, try and reduce them poaching one area at a time, move them off land, or even if you've got some forage crops or something like that you can move them to, and it's almost like a sacrificial field to then put into new grass. So ideally not trying them just munching the same small area for the seasons. This is also if it's a good time of year to soil sample your land if you want to know the status. I'll go on a bit more about how important it is then, but you don't want to do it just after you've applied anything, so it's quite a good time to see what grass you've got. Spring is it's probably the most important season. This kind of sets the basis for how much grass you'll have for the rest of the year. So you want to ensure that you've got enough grass coming through the spring. So you want to graze it so that it's not getting lots of dead matter along the bottom, because if you've got a lot of dead matter that gives less energy and it doesn't give enough sunlight to retiller and to produce new leaves. You also don't want to graze it too hard because there's basically not enough green area to get photosynthesis in to keep the grass improving and to regenerate new grass. Ryegrass and most the grass species start growing about 5 degrees, and any clover in your sward it takes a wee bit more, it's more like 7 degrees. So if you were putting any fertiliser on, especially nitrogen, this is probably the time to do it, because if you've got clover in your sward, hopefully the clover will do the job of nitrogen fertiliser. So if you're putting on any fertiliser on, put it on just as the soil temperature is beginning to increase, because then after that the clover should do the job and you're probably wasting a bit of money. Again, I'll mention it later, but if your pH is too low, so it means that your soil is too acidic, then it's probably not worth putting fertiliser on, because the fertiliser efficiency will be really low. So you'll put it on, but the grass will not be able to utilise it, so you're just doing it for not a lot. The one goal of grass in the spring is to reproduce and set seed. So if you graze it too tightly, and then if you graze it quite tightly and then rest it to ensure it can then regrow, that's probably the ideal. And if you do need any phosphate or potash fertiliser, if you've done a soil sample, this is a good time to get it on. It's making the most of it. The phosphate is good for the roots, and the potash ensures the grass keeps going up the way effectively. So that's the kind of types of fertiliser we put on, is nitrogen, phosphate and potash. The rest are probably more minor nutrients and probably not required. Yeah, moving on to summer. Assuming there's no droughts or hugely wet areas, the real job in summer is to maintain your grass quantity. If you get too much, this is an ideal time to cut it for hay or silage. And you really shouldn't have not enough at this time of year, because if you've not enough in the summer, you're really struggling for the rest of the year. Something called rotational grazing will help reduce the utilisation, and it's also easier to manage, because if you're shutting off paddocks, if one gets away and gets too long growing, you can then cut it. Or if you think it's a year with the grass not growing so much, you can just include that in your rotation. So rotational grazing is moving animals every 3 to 5 days. Some people do it every 12 hours, but more practical is sort of every 3 to 5 days around different paddocks. They graze it down to about 5 centimetres, and then it grows again. I'll do a wee bit more on that if we've got time, but I don't know how relevant the technical stuff. At this time of year, if you're putting on any nitrogen fertiliser, it should be sort of on a supply and demand. So, and this is probably more farmers are very typical of, right, I always put on a bag of nitrogen at this time of year, but he's already got too much grass that his stock can use. So don't be just putting it on just because your neighbour is or because somebody told you. If you don't have enough grass, fair enough, but if you've got plenty of grass, there's no point in putting some more nitrogen on to grow more grass. It's just a bit of a waste of money coming through. Just a quick summary. So in autumn, graze tight and early autumn and do your soil sampling. Winter, look after your soils and do what you can to not graze it too hard. In the spring, put your fertiliser on, lime and graze fairly hard but give it time to rest. And in summer, graze tight and use anything you've got left to use in the summer. If you can, there's different ways to incorporate different grass species into it, and the same with clover. You can do a full reseed, or you can kind of broadcast it, which is kind of spreading it with a fertiliser spreader or by hand if you want. Probably more practical in a smaller area is to do that kind of stuff. So you'd want to graze it really hard, put the seeds on, and then let it come away. If you did a fuel reseed, that field's out of action for months, 6 months, best part of a year, depending on what livestock you have. So it's probably as well to have that kind of thing. Depends on your quantity. There's no point in spending a lot of money on improving your grass species and your clover if you don't have the need for extra grass, or if you don't need any more grassland coming through. So there's no point in putting clover in it if you don't have the need for more productive grasses. So I'll just go through a few grass species. The best thing is to probably have a mix of different grass species. Some ryegrass, some sort of more what they class old-fashioned grasses, and then a bit of clover to come through. So perennial ryegrass, it's a nice persistent variety, so it lasts for quite a few years, 6, 7, 8, depending on the actual species of the grass. It's very responding to nitrogen fertiliser application, and it says good for my notes, but I obviously changed it in the presentation. It's good for cutting as well as grazing, so it's a good all-round kind of fertiliser. A lot of the grass seed mixes are just some perennial ryegrasses and clover mixes that come through. Italian ryegrass is probably more productive, but it's very short-lived, so it will only last in your sward for 2 or 3 years after sowing it. The bonus it has is it comes through quite early, so it'll respond to slightly lower temperatures. So it gives you that bonus. Ryegrasses are known, if you ever pick up your sward, I meant to bring some with me, it's got red roots. So if you pick it up and dig it up, the red roots make you know that it's ryegrass in the sward, as well as what it looks like in the pictures. You probably don't need to differentiate between the ryegrasses in your swards, to be honest. It's there. Timothy, very good for the old horse hay and the old sort of typical pastures, so it's good for hay. It's persistent and it's very tolerant, so if you've got heavy, wet kind of land, Timothy will survive when some of the other grass species will struggle. So yeah, quite a lot of the time they put that in a mix for some of the heavier land that comes through. And cocksfoot, if you feel it, it's got kind of soft leaves, so if you touch it you can just feel kind of like the softer leaves. It's okay for sandy and droughty land. Lower digestibility, so it's not so palatable and it doesn't get broken down in the animal stomach so well as some of the other ones, and it can become quite coarse and tussocky, so it's probably not something you want a lot of in your swards. Maybe if you've got sort of lighter land that is more prone to droughts, it's maybe worth it for that. The one thing that probably is worth trying to incorporate in some of your swards, and again, graze it really hard, put the clover on, and then give it a chance to come away. So it fixes nitrogen. So it basically takes atmospheric nitrogen from its nodules and then produces its own nitrogen into the soil. So it saves you having to buy so much nitrogen fertiliser. It is very nutritious and very palatable, so the stock do like it. The only thing to watch out is it's not, if you've got high levels of nitrogen, it'll cause bloat in your animals. So if you're ever putting them onto a piece of field with a lot of clover in it, make sure they're not hungry, so they've got a stomach full, so they'll just gradually eat it. If they go in hungry, eat a lot and get a belly full, it's not ideal. Clover is a funny thing. You can do everything you think to it, and sometimes it'll not come through very well, and then the next year there'll be lots of it. So it is a kind of unpredictable plant. Make sure you've got lots of phosphorus in the soil if you're trying to establish some clover, because low phosphate is needed to establish the roots and for it to grow. So if you don't have any phosphorus, then you'll really struggle. The other clover we have is red clover. I'm not sure it's something that will be overly useful to this kind of farms. It's primarily used for silage, and it only lasts for 2, 3 or 4 years, and then you need to reseed it again. So it's very productive. It's got a lot of it produces good quality silage, but it's difficult to get it dry, and it probably costs quite a lot of input if you're not needing it for a lot. But I just thought I'd put it in there as a note. This is just a wee note on when do you reseed. So don't worry about too much. It's basically the less perennial ryegrass, which is the left column, the less production you get. So if you're down at 50% of perennial ryegrass, you're only getting 7 tonnes of dry matter, so just 7 tonnes of grass compared to the 13. So don't worry about the rest. It's just to show that the production does reduce when the ryegrass disappears and you get taken over by some of the older ones. Is that decision to reseed? Depends on your situation. It's easy for me to sit here and say, yeah, when the production drops. But if you don't want any more livestock on that land, if you don't want any more cattle or sheep, there's no point in spending a lot on trying to establish more ryegrass if you don't need it. It is really difficult to know when to reseed, but there is definitely a cost to it. There is probably a restriction as to what you can do on that land at the time. And if there's no requirement by the animals, what benefit does it give you? So if you want really productive, it should probably be reseeded every 6, 7 years, full reseeds. But if you don't have that requirement, then it doesn't really give you any benefit from the spend. Just going through a couple of grazing systems. This is possibly more of interest than huge benefit to you, if that makes sense. So one of the really topical things at the moment, and it's the ones that kind of dairy farmers do who produce the most grass possible, is rotational grazing. So basically what you're trying to do is you've got your grass growing and you're eating it down at the 3-leaf stage. So it depends on the type of year. Sometimes it might take 7 days for a leaf. It might take sort of 30 days for a leaf to produce, depends on the ideal sort of growing conditions. So you want to eat in the height of summer when it's growing the best. You probably want to be in each parcel every sort of 21 days, whereas nearer the autumn it might take 90 days to go round. So it's quite a difficult one to manage if you're not needing to cut some for grass, but it is the most efficient way of growing grass. So you split your field into 4, 6, 8 different paddocks, and then you move them every 2, 3, 4 days, something like that. So you're taking the grass round, let it recover, and graze it again. It's very simple in principle. You are wanting to graze the grass down probably no more than 5 centimetres. After grazing hard by 5 centimetres or less, then you're causing sort of issues. There's not enough sunlight able to get into the plant effectively to make it grow and make the most of the nutrients. The problem with the rotational grazing is you need water in each paddock, you need fences to put it up, you need power to produce these fences, so it's not as simple as all that, depending on how well behaved your animals are. Usually it's a one-off spend, so once you've got the fences there, once you've got the water troughs in, that's it. It can stay for however long. So this is just a bit of show how much more productivity you can get from rotational grazing rather to set stocking. So set stocking's when the animals are just in that field for as long as they need to be, whether it's the whole summer or whether it's after a couple of months they get moved off. So even by shifting a field in 2, so you're only shifting them between one and the other, you can still get a 56% increase in the amount of use efficiency of the grass. If you do that in a proper every 6 or 12 hours, 24 hours, you can get up to 92% increase in grass. So if you're short of grass, this is maybe something that's worth considering, even on a smaller scale, you know, shift them every week type thing. It still gives you an improvement compared to just letting them pick the freshest, juiciest grass and letting the other stuff get old, rank and dead leaves. The other one, which is quite topical, is rotational mob or holistic grazing. So that's all the same thing. So that's allowing the grass to grow until it's sort of shot, and then they get in to graze it for, again, 2 to 3 days and get moved on. The huge benefit, I think, to that is, especially if you've got sort of lighter soil, so more sandy soil, you're just putting more of the grass back into it, so it's improving the soil structure, so it's not likely to poach so much, but you are needing to maybe only graze each part twice in a season, maybe 3 times in a season, so it's a lot more difficult to manage, especially on a small scale. They do think it's better for biodiversity because obviously there's more cover for the birds at certain times of year, so you can do sort of chicks can get grazed if the grass isn't grazed that part in the spring. So there is definite benefits to it, but I'm not sure it's not that feasible on a lot of farms. One thing to note is cows are a lot less selective than sheep. So cows basically wrap their tongue around, rip it out and go for it, where sheep kind of nibble on it. So cows are worse for poorer soils because they are just ripping it every time they take a mouthful. It's just something maybe to take a note of if you're looking at biodiversity, if you're wanting something. Cows are not necessarily the best, they chomp on everything, they rip everything out, so if you're worried about biodiversity then that's maybe not it. As a note, sheep are much better at controlling weeds, so if you've got a weed problem and you've only got cattle, stick some sheep on and they'll munch, especially something like ragwort, they seem to munch it at the little rosette stage just before it comes out the ground, and it saves you having quite such a problem with some of the weeds. Just a picture of typical overgrazing. You can see that they've just started to compact it all. Even on a bigger hill, they can still munch it down. Doesn't do you much good to the soil or to the animals, to be honest, because they're just squelching their way through it. So just try and avoid it if possible. Always keep the 5 centimetres of grass if you can. I know it's easy to say, but it's not necessarily as easy in practice. I don't think the video will work because I think you're not connected to the internet.
I am connected to the internet.
That should be. See if you can press play on that one. There should be No. So this is just a bit to cover about the soil status, and this is probably one of the cheaper ways of sorting soils is your lime. Fertiliser has shot through the roof, so it's doubled plus in price. So you really want to make the most of it if you're going to buy any. So the real thing I think is important is to try and get your soil status for this. So if you want to test your soil, you can do it. It probably is worth doing before you put in if you're going to apply fertiliser at all. And the one thing that's probably the most important is the pH. So you really want a pH 6 to 6.2, probably 6.2 for grassland. If you've got a bit of arable, 6 is closer. So to improve the soil status, you apply lime, and you can just get various types of lime. It doesn't usually matter what kind, as long as you're putting it on. You can get limes that you put on annually, or you can put lime that you put on once every 5-ish years, depending on your status. This is just a wee diagram that shows, the table shows what nutrients are locked up when the soil status isn't there. So you can take a sample of your soil, the nutrients are there, but the plant can't uptake it when the soil status isn't high enough. And again, the NP and the K in the table, so that shows how much of your usual NP and K, nitrogen, phosphate and potash fertilisers get taken up. So if your pH is down at 5, you're putting all that fertiliser on, and you're only getting about 50% of the nitrogen and the potash, but you're only getting about a third of the phosphate. Fertiliser's dear enough as it was. What's the point of putting that on when you can't? You're probably about 25 to 30 pounds a tonne to get lime on, whereas fertiliser at the moment is 600 pounds a tonne plus. So you are significantly better off getting the lime, and then that'll improve your fertiliser status. The right pH also sorts the microbial breakdown, so all the wee bugs in the soil that help break down your dry matter. So if you've got any dung and stuff, these wee bugs can't work at a low pH. It needs to be up about the 6 for them to work. So if you're putting dung on, again, it'll just be lying there doing nothing if your pH isn't high enough. So you just want these wee bugs to be able to work to their optimum. Again, this can be done with a soil sample. Some of the liming companies will even do the pH for you for free, just to get the sale of the lime. So it's not like it's going to cost you a lot, or even to get just the limes, not expensive. Probably is worth getting the P&K done at the same time. You can't soil sample for nitrogen, but just to see what you're dealing with. The soil status might be fine, so there's no point spending the money on lime when you don't know. Just as a quick note, grass can use up to 2.5 kilos of nitrogen a day in ideal situations. Clover can produce a lot of that, but in ideal situations it can use quite a lot, so it can be quite expensive. But if it's only utilising 50% of that because the pH isn't high enough, you probably need a lot more to get there. So yeah, just a few key points. Kind of know your soil. I can say here, but you know whether it's a heavy land, whether it's a sandy soil, whether it's very clay. You know what kind of grass it's growing. So there's no point in me sitting here saying this is exactly what you should do until you see it and you know what you're doing. You want a biodiversity in this world, so you don't want all ryegrass, you don't want all clover, you don't want all sort of cockfoot. You just want a bit of everything. Remember to rest the land. So it does need that bit of peace to regrow, rather than if you keep munching it down, the sunlight doesn't get to it. The animals select the best bits, and the rest comes old and dead leaves, and it's unpalatable, and the energy's a little bit. Try and keep it as leafy as you can. Again, keep the growth there. The sunlight can get in it. The animals have got good nutritional land to eat, and if possible, try and get some clover into it. It really helps. The animals like it, and it saves you on some of the fertiliser costs. So if you're disappointed in any of your grass, the really question is like why, which part is it, and what can you do about it? And I think that's me.
suggest for a field that's being left for a number of years and it's been overtaken by rushes, how would you manage that best to get decent score back?
Difficultly.
Yeah.
So to sort rushes, the ideal is you top it and then you let it come away again, and it's the green growth that you then spray, because by topping it you're taking away that hard film on it. But the problem is they'll need to come back, so ideally you're wanting to sort out the drainage and probably the lime actually, because rushes grow better in low pH soils. So if you can sort out the reasons, if not they'll just keep coming back. But yeah, there's not an easy
Is
fix.
is a last resort just to do a complete reseed?
Probably, but again, you'll need to sort the reason behind them, because you can reseed it, that'll get rid of them for now, and then they'll just come back if you don't sort out the stuff that the rushes like effectively.
How important is using a harrow to break the grass?
Ideally, if you can manage the grass, you shouldn't need it, because harrowing is just removing the dead stuff at the bottom. But it does definitely open up the sward, especially if you're going to put some sort of broadcast some new grass on. It's good because the seeds do need soil contact, and if there's just too much dead grass under them, then it will not need it. So it is worth doing, especially if you're going to put some clover or some.
I'm thinking of how there is quite a bit of dead grass in there.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't do any harm, and it does improve, opens up. So even if you're not reseeding, some of the grass that's there, I'll sort of till it out onto it and become more productive.
We also went to, I think it's Cotswold seeds, because we've got a few pigs that we wanted to bring it back, and then we provided us with a mix of seeds with grasses that were suitable for pigs.
Yeah.
But we hope it will stop the digging. Step in the right direction. It didn't mean you were putting the grasses.
Yeah, it is best going to the grass seed guys and saying, right, I want a long-term grass, and they'll pick, because there is, although I've been quite basic about the ryegrasses, there's hundreds of different varieties of the ryegrass, and some are better suited to different land types and different, so the grass seed guys will know exactly which mix to give you. As for some people do put the pigs in before they're going to do a reseed, and they use them as the digging up the land, so I'm not sure that's going to stop them on the other side, but they might do for the start.
Grass that chickens don't like.
No idea, I'm afraid. I forgot to bring through, there's a wee code. If you can come past our stand and do that, we need, because this is a government funded presentation, is there any chance you can come past our stand and just take with your phone and just say you've been here, and then it will take you to an evaluation form, and if you can do that at some point, that would be great. I realised I forgot one just now, so it'll be sitting on the stand. If you can come past the SAC one, that would be great. Thank you.